I was recently hired to make a bar height epoxy river table. In this video, I'm going to show you how I build this table, and I'm going to talk about the challenge of dealing with a high center of gravity due to the heaviness of this table and the height that the customer required. So we're going to get into the design of that and how this thing is built. Stay tuned. To begin, I purchased a slab, and I had to have this thing planed and cut. And so there's a local mill that has a large planer that they will plane these live edge slabs. So they planed it down just to clean it up, and then they also ripped it right down the middle. And the reason I needed that done was I needed to get two pieces so I can form this river in the center. And the customer wanted a live edge on the outside where the people would sit. So it's going to be straight edge on the one side, a live edge on the other, and then a river in the middle. So that live edge on the inside is going to form part of that river. Now, to begin, I used a square. I squared up the end of each board on one end, and then I measured and cut the other end so that the two pieces were the same length. This is not my final length. I will make a final cut later, but I needed them the same length so they fit in the forms properly. Now, because I needed a live edge look on three edges, and you can only get live edge off of two edges of a slab, I needed to come up with a solution to that. So in the middle where the river is, I wanted it to kind of the edge to meander on both sides of that river. So what I did was I took my handheld jigsaw and I set it at an angled cut, and I just kind of cut a random shape drifting in and away from the edge and then back towards the edge on the straight side of the piece that's going to be towards the front of the table. So I didn't explain this, but it is going to go behind a sofa. So I kind of have a front and a back. The front is the live edge, the back is the straight edge. So this is just going to meander along, and I didn't really have a set cut. I just knew I needed it to be an angle so that it would appear that it's live edge on both sides of that river. Now, my blade was not long enough to actually reach the whole way through if I cut too far towards the center of that board, but that's okay. It still gives the appearance. I knew that my epoxy, the color I was going to put into it was going to be a thick enough color that you would never see the actual wood down inside of this river that we're creating. So nobody would ever know that the cut doesn't go the whole way to the bottom unless they looked on the bottom side. Next, I got a palm sander out and I just sanded those live edges. There's sometimes where a palm sander won't work because the edge has too drastic of a curve to it and you can't get it in the nooks and crannies. This one had a real gradual curve, so it worked really well. It's good even to sand the edges that are going to be in epoxy. There's always these little remnants of the bark that are still left on. They can come out, end up floating in your epoxy, and on the side where you don't have epoxy, they could end up falling off or causing your finish not to stick very well. So I always think it's a very good idea just to remove as much as possible. Now, however, I do like to try to keep as much characteristic I can into that edge. So a lot of times when you get these live edges, you can see evidence of insects that were eating on the edge of the tree. I usually like to keep those in. I think it just adds some cool character to see what that tree went through at one point in time. So once we sand these and get all the dust off, we're ready to make a form. Now, one challenge I have with this table is it needed to be 10 foot long. None of my benches are 10 feet long, and I had to build a form that was going to extend past my bench. So what I decided to do was to slide one of my other benches up against the other, which essentially made it a 12-foot long bench in that area. However, to span that gap, I had to tie those together with some of the seam tape that I use for making these epoxy forms. So I tried to get them so they were as level as possible. There was a slight variation. I had to put some shims in underneath, and then I just taped the seam really well so that it wasn't going to leak. Next, I had to address the tops of these tables. I don't tear this tape off, and I tend to work on top of them a lot. Things get spilled. It just gets messy. So I decided it'd be best to retape at least the area where epoxy would end up. So I taped down the middle, get all this retaped, resealed up. And if you haven't seen my videos before or haven't seen this done before, this is seam tape. You can get it on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description, but they use it for house wrap, I believe. But it also works really well with epoxy because the epoxy doesn't really stick to it. So you can pour right on top of it, use it as a form, and you won't have too much difficulty getting the epoxy to peel off of it like you would some other materials where it would just bond. So it works really well for that purpose. So we just tape this up really good to make sure that we don't have any bad spots where the epoxy might stick to something underneath. Now it's time to set the slab and build the form around it. So we start by getting an end cap, and what I do is I have a piece of MDF wrapped in this same tape that we put on the tabletop, and it has pocket hole screws on the back side. And I just put silicone on the bottom of that, and then I screw the pocket hole screws into the pocket holes and attach it to the table where I want it. Now, hopefully, if I do this right, the silicone will ooze out a little bit and form a nice seal underneath where the epoxy is going to end up running. After that, we take some time to try to get a really good idea of where these two slabs need to set. I was going for a certain width, and I had to make sure that I hit that, and so I measured it in several different places and got them aligned how I wanted. Now, when you're dealing with live edge, sometimes it's difficult to get the width that you want because that live edge side does drift a little bit. So you kind of have to just figure what's the maximum and what's the minimum you want it and make your adjustments until you get it how you want. After I had a pretty good idea of how I wanted it, I did apply a little bit of silicone to the ends of the boards at the end where I had already fastened that end cap. And what this does is it helps seal that up so you don't have an epoxy leak as you fill this river in the center of these two boards. If you don't do this, it's going to end up leaking out and you're going to have a mess. I can remember the first time I did this, I didn't know to do this at the time, and I had it leaking out this ends, and I was like trying to make a dam with basically a hot glue gun just to try to stop it from flowing. It was a mess. I wasted a bunch of epoxy and learned a huge lesson. So this is a result of what I learned from that lesson, and I really haven't had any epoxy leak out the ends ever since I started doing this. Once we're done with the one end, we go to the other end. We do the exact same thing. Silicone on a pocket hole piece of MDF that's wrapped in this tape. Put a little bit of silicone on the ends of the two boards. Stick the end of the form against the two boards, screw it down, and we're ready to move on. Now, one thing I noticed was I had a few spots where there were gaps where these slabs met the table. It may have been due to that transition between the two different tables. I'm not sure, or it could have just been the slabs weren't quite straight at that point in time. So what I decided was I really didn't want the epoxy to leak up underneath there at all. And I thought, well, let me get some blocks out. And I have some blocks that are already pre-wrapped with tape, so they are not going to stick to whatever it is I'm using epoxy on. And I placed the blocks on there and then just got some 2x4s and used clamps on the ends of the 2x4 and drew the ends of the 2x4 down to the table. This created downward pressure enough that I was confident that the gaps were small enough that I wouldn't have a lot of epoxy loss up underneath these slabs. I was actually a little bit fearful that it would completely leak out through the opposite side. So I felt after I was done doing this that everything was good and we were ready to move on. I let all the silicone dry and we were ready for epoxy. Now, one thing I like to do is I like to pour a really thin layer in to start. And what I'll do with this thin layer is I'll make sure the bottom is coated, and then I actually brush that epoxy up those live edge sides. Now there's two reasons I do this. The first reason is by brushing it up the sides, it helps to seal all the grain that the epoxy is going to come in contact with. What that will do is it will prevent air bubbles that are maybe trapped inside that grain from leaking out at inopportune times throughout the drying process. If you don't do this, you could easily get extra bubbles bubbling out of your epoxy, and it seems like it always happens right as it's hardening, and there's times where you just can't catch it. So this has helped prevent that problem. The other thing this does is by letting it puddle a little bit into the bottom, just a nice thin layer, it forms a seal so that no more epoxy can seep underneath those slabs. Now, I've tried doing this without doing this and just pouring deep right away. And what tends to happen is I feel like there's so much weight from that epoxy that it just because of gravity, if you pour a deep pour, will try to push it up underneath those slabs, and you're going to lose a lot underneath, and it could seep out the other sides even if you're not careful. So by doing this, it'll seal that up, and then the coming layers of epoxy that you pour in, it doesn't really matter how heavy they are, it can't go anywhere but fill it up to the top like you intended. So this has worked really well, and you can use various items to brush these sides. I use a brush in this video, but I've used sticks. I just make sure it's coated, and there's not a exact science to it. This brush was kind of old, so it was fine to ruin it. If you're going to use a brush, I would get a cheap one. If you don't have one you're just ready to get rid of. So that works really well, and then we will be ready to start pouring in the next layers. One thing I like to do in between coats is just get an old piece of sandpaper and just scuff everything up real well. It helps the epoxy bond to the previous coat. Now, the instructions from the manufacturer say that you don't necessarily have to do this if you pour soon enough after the first coat is dried. I had to wait till the next day on a lot of these coats, so I end up scuffing in between pretty much every coat. Now, you don't have to worry about the scratches because it kind of self-repairs as you pour the next layer in. You'll never see those scratches again. One thing you do want to do is try to get the dust out as best you can. But other than that, scuff it away. I used 80 grit sandpaper, I believe, for this, so and it looked perfectly fine. So we'll do that, and then we'll pour the next layer in. So now we're ready to pour some deeper pours. And what I'm using here is super clear tabletop epoxy. You can get it on Amazon. I will provide a link in the description. This stuff is amazing. I use it on everything. It's very well priced. It holds up really well. I've been extremely happy with this product. I highly recommend it. So that's what we're going to use for all of this. And the color we are using for this table is Eye Candy Pigments Tiger. All that will be down in the description. And what we're going to do here is I'm just going to show you video of me constantly pouring. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this. In fact, we're just going to kind of speed through it so that you can see it fill up, because it was a long, drawn out process. I filled 64 ounces at a time, and it took numerous pours. So enjoy this little segment, and we'll get on to the rest of the build. I stopped just a little short of the top of the wood for the fill because I thought that the wood was a little bit thicker than I wanted for the tabletop. I was trying to reduce the weight at the top side of the table to make it less top heavy. Then once everything was dry, I just took apart all the forms and got the tabletop released from the surface of my workbench. This takes a little bit of work. You usually have to drive some shims up underneath the tabletop to get it to peel away from the surface of the workbench. It's not too hard to do though. It just takes a few shims to get it to pop. Next, I took the entire slab off to a business that has a very wide surface planer and wide belt sander all in one. Now that business is an Amish run business, and I'm sure they don't appreciate me videoing, so I didn't film any of that process. However, when it came back, there were a few issues I needed to fix on the top. Some spots where there was a little bit of air pockets that were going to probably be a problem for the surface. Stuff like knots and some splits that were in the wood originally resurfaced a little bit, and I like to fill those in so that if someone were writing on a piece of paper, that their pencil or pen tip doesn't go into a hole and then rip through the paper. So I always try to make sure that the surface is just fully filled before I progress into putting the finish on. Next, I marked the ends. Now the first end, I just marked a square cut on this. I wanted to make sure I cut all that silicone that was stuck on the ends off, and then I just needed it to be straight. So I marked that end and I made the cut, and then I measure and mark the other end and make the cut down there. Now once I'm done making these cuts, I have a router bit that I use, and it's just a flush trim bit. It's very large. It's a little scary to use at times, but I just clamp a board on the end of each and each end of the slab, and that board is a nice straight edge, and that flush trim bit just runs along the end of the slab, and what it does is it just cleans up any imperfections that are caused by that circular saw. You tend to get a little bit of blade marks. You may not be 100% square because from when you hit that epoxy, the saw definitely cuts different from the wood, and I often feel it lifting up, like there's so much more resistance when it hits that epoxy. So I'm always fearful that I don't have a really nice true cut on the end, and so my easy solution is just to hit it with that flush trim bit and clean everything up. It gets a really nice job on it, and then I can sand it the rest of the way. Now I'm only going to show you the one end of this. Just know that I did the exact same thing in the other end. The only difference is at the other end, I had a measurement that I was targeting, and I made sure I hit that mark for my cut instead of just trying to clean off the leftover silicone that was on the end of the board. Next, I sanded everything. Now, I started with 80 grit, and I went up through the whole way up to 320 grit sandpaper. When I do this, I'm very careful to make sure I have clean sheets, especially on the top, because the epoxy can tend to clog the sandpaper up, and when it does, it creates kind of weird sanding patterns, and you get some swirl marks, or you're have a little bit of more tendency to get the swirl marks, and those really start to show up, and they're hard to get rid of if you aren't careful. So I always just check my sandpaper periodically, make sure everything's good, make sure it's clean, and once I got to 320 grit, I stopped. One other thing I like to do is I like to make sure that I start on the bottom and I sand the bottom first. And the one reason I do that is because I have had it in the past where just the vibration of the sander can cause a table to move a little bit, the top to move a little bit. And if there's anything on your bench, it can cause gouges in your workpiece. That's also why I have towels underneath it. It helps stop that, but I would rather have gouges on the bottom than on the top. Nobody ever looks at the bottom. Now, this ends up being perfectly fine, but it's more of a precaution to save me a lot of extra work. So I just try to make sure that the very last thing I sand is the top. Now it's time for finish, and for any kind of hardwoods or really nice pieces, I like to use a product called Odie's Oil. Now this is a product I typically use without staining the board. It's more of just a surface protectant, and it does a beautiful job of bringing the natural characteristics out of the wood. It's one of the reasons I like it. It just has a really nice sheen to it, real low sheen. You can really see the depth of the grain when you use it. So when you apply this, you take just a non-woven pad, like a Scotch pad, and you just work it into the grain in circular patterns. And I've seen people take Bondo spreaders and smear it all over the board, and I've talked to actually people from this company, and they said it's not the correct way to do it. You want to work it into the grain. So this is how it's actually supposed to be applied. It does not take very much product to work it in, especially once that pad gets somewhat not saturated but coated with the product. It stretches a long way. So you work it in the entire surface. You let it just dry, not dry, but you just let it set for a few hours, and then you come back in and you just buff it out like you would like a car wax. And it's really all that's all there is to it. You just want to make sure that you get all the product off that is left over. If you don't, you tend to not get quite as good of a finish. I've had one issue in the past where I put too much on, completely my fault, and I didn't get it all off the first time, and it just caused a few little problems that I had to figure out. But once I worked through that, it was fine. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to put too much on, and you want to make sure you buff any excess off at the end. Now we're applying this to the bottom. I'm going to flip it over, and I do the exact same thing to the top. I don't feel you want to watch me do two sides of this, so we're just going to speed through this and get on to the rest of the project. There is one thing I do want to add, though, is before you actually put the finish on, you can use denatured alcohol and wipe the entire top down, and it'll collect all that dust that's sitting on top, because it is kind of hard to get that dust off. You can also use tack cloths and things like that you buy at the hardware store. I usually use my air compressor to clean a good bit of it off, but denatured alcohol works really well. It evaporates really quick after applying it, so it really doesn't affect the wood at all, and it doesn't affect the epoxy, so it does a really good job of getting that residual dust off. I sourced the legs from a local fabricator shop, and I set them on. Now, there's a few things I had to deal with this. Because this is such a tall table, being bar height, I was really worried about the weight of that top. So I had to make sure that the legs were extra stable. And I decided that I definitely needed a leg in the center, because I was afraid with that span that we would have a little bit of sag in the center of this table if it wasn't supported. So I wanted 3 legs. And the other thing was that I wanted those leg bases so the footprint that it had on the floor to be at least as wide as the top. And the reason for that is I wanted to completely reduce and eliminate any kind of chance for this thing to tip over. And I was actually very nervous up until the point where I bolted these things on and stood them up, because I wasn't 100% sure that it was going to be as stable as I would like. And I was very pleasantly surprised. Now these legs, man, they have to weigh probably 70 pounds each. They're so heavy. And so I think that helped a lot with the stabilization of this entire table. That and the actual width of the legs, because they do flare out at the base to as wide, if not wider in some spots than the top, it really stabilized things. And the great thing about the width at the base, you can't really tell that it's as wide as the top, really. You look at where it attaches to the table and you can see it's not even close, but it's actually 4 inches wider on the floor than it is on that top plate. So these fabricators did a great job of making these custom legs. I was very happy with them. One other issue you sometimes will have with legs is those bolt holes where you mount them, sometimes these guys will make them so that they're so close to the actual leg that it's really hard to pre-drill a hole. These things were offset a really nice amount, had plenty of room to drill, nice straight holes, so everything worked out perfect with this. So before we actually drill the holes, I like to take a center punch and try to get that center punch dead center in that hole, and just give me a little dimple in the top of that, or actually the bottom of that table, so that I have a nice spot that I'm sure to hit when I go to drill these holes, and I can get them as close to being centered as possible on those holes that are pre-drilled in that mounting plate. So I tap those in. I get the right size drill bit, which is just slightly smaller than the lag that I'm going to be putting in. And I have the drill bit marked so that there's no way I can drill deeper than what the bolt will go. You really want to make sure that you don't accidentally drill through the top, because you have a giant problem if that happens. So I just take some masking tape, I'll take electrical tape, I'll take whatever tape I have on hand, and I just mark that tape at the depth that I want to stop at. You still got to be careful, because sometimes when you're drilling holes, that bit can grab and kind of get away from you. And there was actually one point where I was a little nervous. It went a little faster in one spot than I had anticipated, and I thought, oh no, what if I went through? I didn't, but I had a little panicked moment because it just went a little faster than I thought. So drill those holes out, and then we're just going to bolt the legs on, and we do this for all 3 of the leg sets, and we're ready to go. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope this was very informative. I hope you got some ideas on how you could take on a challenge such as this. Building a large table does produce some extra challenges. Some of it is just moving it around. Some of it is fitting it on workbenches. But the concept behind it is no different from doing a large table or a small serving tray or end table. You still use the same techniques, just on a larger scale. So if you like this video, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and watch these videos on this next screen, and we'll catch you next time.